It is Martin Luther King Day. Welcome to the program, everyone. I'm Christiana Manpour in London. A new era of American politics begins this week with Joe Biden's inauguration, and he plans to hit the ground running from day one, getting control of the COVID pandemic and the economic havoc that it has wrought. Biden has introduced a $1.9 trillion spending package to speed up the distribution of vaccines and provide immediate financial relief to people. His plan focuses on bigger stimulus checks, aid to the unemployed and those who are facing eviction, as well as to additional help for small businesses, state and local governments. Despite the predictable conservative pushback over budget deficits, most major economic institutions say this is unlike any previous crisis. My first guest says now is the time to be big and bold. Paul Krugman is a Nobel Prize-winning economist and author. He's joining me now from New York. Welcome back to the program, Paul Krugman. And I guess I just take it from one of your recent columns where you say about Biden, the advice is damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Break that down for us.
Okay, so the important background is two things. One is that this ain't over, that the pandemic is going to continue to have a crippling effect on the economy, at least into the summer and maybe some ways into the fall. We're not going to, I'm just relying on the epidemiologists here, but we're not going to be able to resume business as usual until a large percentage of the population is vaccinated, which means that's going to take a long time. During that period, life is going to be very, very hard. Lots of jobs cannot come back until the virus is under control. And on the other side, money is not a constraint. The U.S. government can borrow at incredibly low interest rates, well below the rate of inflation and even further below the growth rate of the economy, which is what really matters, so that there really is effectively no budget constraint. So this is a time to spend a lot of money on keeping people, keeping governments, keeping businesses whole until the pandemic is under control.
And it looks like President-elect is inclined to take that advice. We just said that he's unveiled this $1.9 trillion stimulus relief. I'm not sure exactly how you term it, but nonetheless, injection. And so many financial institutions are tending to agree with what you're saying. Just want to play what Biden himself says about the urgency of the moment.
And it's not hard to see that we're in the middle of the once-in-several-generations economic crisis, with a once-in-several-generations public health crisis. The crisis of deep human suffering is in plain sight, and there's no time to waste. We have to act, and we have to act now. This is what economists are telling us. More importantly, it's what the values we hold dear in our hearts as Americans are telling us.
So, Paul Krugman, there is your advice, and then, as I said, there's pushback from conservatives, maybe other economists. Tell me, though, in general, where do most economists land on advice for the current calamity?
There's really not a lot of dissent from the view that something like what Biden is proposing is the right thing to do. I mean, you can always find somebody who's on the other side. Of course, you'll find that, conservative, basically people who are operatives who are on the other side. But there's been a sea change in economic opinion about deficits. The truth is that the panic over deficits 10 years ago was much more in the political sphere than the economic sphere. Economists were always much more relaxed about them than you would have believed if you only listened to the talk shows. But even from there, now economists have learned a lot. The world has changed, but also we've learned that a lot of the concerns that seem to be pressing to at least some of my colleagues are not. So there's really very little argument about the ability to go big. And the nature of the problem, the severity of it is really clear. It's, we've learned a lot about the damage, the long-term damage that failing to provide short-term support can inflict. So this is really, in other words, you need to cushion people. You need to get people through this in the present, not just to make it easier in the present, but to avoid long-term damage in the future. If you can say, it's a little bit like, with the long-termers on COVID. If we don't do COVID economic relief, we'll get long-term economic damage as well as long-term health damage.
So you've obviously been remarkably consistent. Last time around, 2008, 2009, you criticized the Obama administration for actually being too cautious. And particularly, it appears that the bailout, as it was called then, was targeted towards the banks, towards the big infrastructure. This looks like it's different, right? This looks like it's not to jumpstart massive economic growth immediately. It's more to resuscitate the economy and help ordinary people. Can you sort of break down the difference between what Biden is trying to do compared to what the Obama administration bailout was before?
Yeah, the last time around we had a financial crisis. The cause of the crisis was internal. The economy was overstretched. The private sector was overstretched. There was too much borrowing. Housing prices were unrealistic and they crashed. And that led to a lot of constraint. And so the problem with the economy was that there was not enough spending because of this economic breakdown. This time, although spending is down somewhat, it's down not because people can't spend, but because they don't dare to spend. Who's going to go to, well, some people will go to restaurants, but you really shouldn't, and we really want to constrain that. So the problem, but the economic suffering is very real. So this is very much not about trying to juice up the economy so much as it is about making the necessary shutdown, the necessary constraints. I don't know if we're still calling it a lockdown, but whatever. It's about making the difficult times less difficult, with there being essentially, again, no real constraints. The money is available. In fact, the world is awash in savings, looking for someplace to go. The bond market is begging the government to borrow some money and put it to some use. So it's a very different kind of economic crisis, but the lesson that we should have learned, that some of us were tearing our hair out about in 2009, remains. Go big. Don't do it by half measures. The risk of doing too little is much greater than the risk of doing too much. And above all, of course, don't count on being able to, get a political consensus to do stuff later on. We've seen how that movie ends, and it doesn't end well. So, Biden came in with a bigger plan than most people had expected, and almost every economist I know was cheering.
It's really so interesting for me as a layperson to hear you say that the world is awash in money, that the bond people are begging to be able to use that money to some good. And I think that's just, people can understand that instead of thinking, oh my goodness, oh panic, we're going to go into massive debt, what's that going to mean, et cetera, et cetera. But you talk about politics, and so I want to ask you to react to this then, because last time you said the politicians were way more negative than the economists were, and this time Pat Toomey, who's a fiscal conservative from Pennsylvania, says, in response to the $1.9 trillion, in less than 1 year, Congress has spent $3.4 trillion on direct COVID relief aid and nearly doubled the entire federal budget, blasting out another $2 trillion in borrowed or printed money. When the ink on December's $1 trillion aid bill is barely dry and much of the money is not yet spent, would be a colossal waste and economically harmful. So you're essentially saying he's incorrect on the merits, but what about the politics? Because doesn't a lot of this require Biden to get consensus and approval?
Well, that's the interesting thing. I mean, if that election, that runoff in Georgia was enormously important. It gives the Democrats by the narrowest possible margin control of the Senate, and they have a narrow margin in the House, and that allows them to do a lot of stuff. The filibuster can be bypassed for a lot of things, which Obama could have done also, but wasn't willing to because he didn't fully understand what he was facing politically. But Biden obviously does after all we've been through. So this can be done. I mean, obviously, the most conservative Democrats are needed. If Joe Manchin says no, then things don't happen. So it's going to be somewhat tailored. But I think there's a broad acceptance within the Democratic Party of the need to go big here, and the Republicans are going to do what they're going to do. But I'd say not only their political position, but their moral position is weakened because they, after screaming about deficits under Obama, they suddenly stopped caring under Trump, and it's really hard to turn the outrage back on as soon as a new president is installed. So, people have, in a way, taken their measure, and it's not going to stop them from saying the usual things, but it is going to reduce the extent to which they're taken seriously.
So just remind why the deficits have ballooned under Trump.
Oh, well, Trump, even before the pandemic, the deficits were up, and basically, partly it's actually, a lot of it is the tax cut, the 2017 tax cut, big handout to corporations, to some extent to high-income individuals. It was supposed to produce a giant surge in investment, which never happened. But also, in fact, the spending constraints. Federal spending was held in a vice grip as long as there was a Democrat in the White House, and as soon as it was a Republicans in Congress were willing to loosen that and extend the tap. So if you look at the Trump record, the big thing is the tax cut, but then there are also things like all of that extremely generous aid to farmers.